The title of sainthood is a very coveted title across Christian history. The title saint denotes that the person's life was lived in a way that all Christians should seek to emulate. It's not shocking that a vast majority of saints come from the early church. These individuals helped grow Christianity into what it is today, and their stories are ones that exemplify the godly lifestyles that leads to sainthood. Within church history, there is one occupation that seems to be a pipeline of sorts to gaining the title of saint throughout history. The position of Bishop of Rome, also known as Pope in the Roman Catholic Church, is considered to be the highest position a human can attain within the tradition. Tasked with being the direct link from the divine to the human, it is no surprise that there have been so many God-fearing and devout men who have held this position with reverence and humility. Matter of fact, 80 popes have officially been given the title of saint, with 2 servant of God's, 1 venerated, and 9 blessed, indicating the process of being declared a saint. But there was never such a clear time in history where having the position of pope equaled sainthood than that of the early church. Of the first 35 popes, all were eventually given saint status. Of the first 50 popes, 48 were saints. But this didn't mean just anyone could get the title of saint. Even being a pope in the early church didn't guarantee sainthood. Today, we are looking at Liberius, the 36th pope in the Roman Catholic tradition, and the first officially recognized pope not to be given the status of saint. The official reasons Liberius is not considered a saint is because he did not die as a martyr, no contemporary put forth an effort to start the process, the questionable state of his doctrinal beliefs, and there seems to be no historical evidence of any miraculous events associated with his name. These 4 things combined mean that the Roman Catholic Church cannot say for certain that Liberius is currently in heaven and has the authority to intercede on behalf of us Christians. But that is only the surface level of the discussion. And the conversation is actually much deeper when examining the highs and the lows of Liberius' life and ministry. For many, the title of saint has less to do with the certainty of their placement in heaven, as we currently speak, and rather exemplify Christians who have one way or another lived a life that Christians, no matter your denominational affiliation, can look at as someone who exemplified Christ on earth. I do also want to make a quick note that technically in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, Liberius is seen as a saint. But for this video, since we are looking at his life in relation to the position as Pope, which the Eastern Orthodox reject, I will continually refer to him as not having the status of sainthood. So how did Liberius, a Pope in the early church and seemingly one of the most influential leaders in his day, miss out on the title? Well, that comes down to the fact that he did not make a strong enough impression for historians to be assured of his relationship to orthodoxy compared to the heretical view of Jesus' divinity known as Arianism. We have the writings of Athanasius, who was on the wrong side of a lot of Liberius' orders, who called out Liberius as a terrible Christian leader. But on the other hand, you have Pope Pius IX, who argues Liberius did nothing at all counter to the teachings of the church. The truth is that the answer lies somewhere in between. Does the fact that he was not considered a saint mean that his life and works are inherently bad? Absolutely not. We must remember that being declared a saint is an extremely difficult title to obtain, and almost every Christian who has ever lived has not obtained this title, no matter how great or mundane their life was. Let us remember that he did not miss out on this title because there was something unredeemable about his life, but rather, just like the rest of us, his life was messy at times, and he struggled to know his next best step and ended up falling a few times. As we turn to the life of Liberius, I want to talk through the history that we know and see why Liberius was the first pope not to be named saint and what that means for our lives as Christians. The early life of Liberius follows the same pattern of many early Christian leaders throughout history, meaning we don't have much factual information about his early life. Because of this, the best guess that we have is Liberius entered into the world in the early 300s AD. We do know that his early life made enough of an impact that he would make his way up through the Christian ranks and make his way to be in Rome, one of the largest hubs of Christianity in the early church. On May 17, 352 AD, he was given the position as Bishop of Rome, which the Roman Catholic Church has retroactively referred to as the title of Pope. We first hear Liberius in relation to a council that the Emperor Constantius II had called together. Emperor Constantius II was the son of Emperor Constantine the Great, and would, through many bloody battles, eventually be the sole leader of the Roman Empire after his father's death. But for today's story, he was a champion of the movement known as Arianism. How closely he held these beliefs is debated, but he fought hard to get the greater Christian community not only to welcome, but to adopt Arianism as the major belief in Christianity. This is the context in which Liberius makes his initial debut. Constantius had called together the Counts of Arles in 353, where he called for the support of Arianism, a support of Arius, and the rejection of communion with Athanasius of Alexandria, a strong defender of the Nicene Creed and strong fighter against Arianism. We know that Constantius had invited Liberius to attend, but one of the first troubles with his leadership was shown. Instead of attending the council himself and making a strong statement against the Arian movement, he sent two papal legates to argue against Arianism. The two papal legates, Bishop Vincentius of Capua and Bishop Marcellius of Campania, were severely outnumbered as the majority of the bishops that were in the council were already Arians. It was clear that Constantius intended on forcing everyone there to agree to his agenda before they were allowed to leave. Although the two delegates fought hard, they would eventually agree to condemn Athanasius, a pillar for orthodoxy, if the council would agree to condemn Arius. This, of course, would never actually happen, and after they signed the agreement to condemn Athanasius, that was all there was, and the bishops quickly circulated this as if the Pope himself had condemned Athanasius without any of the original context of the agreement. To see how things played out in the life of Athanasius, click on the icon at the top of this video or wait until the end and you can watch my video on Athanasius and see why the Arians disliked him and his authority so much. It is no shock that when Liberius was made aware of the results of the council, he went into extreme damage control. His lack of leadership to attend the council himself and his failure to take a major stand against Arianism was quickly getting out of hand. And this would snowball to where many began to question the orthodoxy of Liberius. He quickly sent out a letter to the emperor in an attempt to have him hold another council to discuss the actions taken by the Counts of Arles. He stated that he wanted them to reverse the decision made and that the condemnation of Athanasius was uncalled for. The emperor would agree to hold another council, and in 355, the Council of Milan was called, and much of the same content from the previous council would be on the agenda. In a shocking turn, and highlighting the growing view as Liberius as weak against the Arian movement, he would not attend this meeting either. Rather, once again sending some papal legates to argue on behalf of Orthodox Nicene Creed theology. But no theology would ever be discussed at this or the previous council. The Arians had no intentions of debating theology. Rather, they called the two councils together in an effort to try to intimidate non-Arian bishops and condemn those outspoken against them. I believe this highlights the fact that rather than a true theological understanding and conviction about Jesus, Constantius and many of the other bishops viewed Arianism as a way to take over the church and to create for themselves a political power that they could hold and wield any way they chose. Nevertheless, Constantius once again pushed that all bishops there accept the Arian view and to condemn Athanasius. When the legates brought up that it violated the canon law to put a bishop on trial when they were not present, he did not care. The Arian crowd began threatening their opposition to recant their faith in Nicene orthodoxy and to voice support of Arianism. When not enough people had changed their mind, Constantius moved the hearing from the church to the imperial palace and began threatening the life of those in attendance as well as those back in their hometowns. At this point, many had been broken down and eventually all but 3 succumbed to the threats of violence and signed their support of Arianism. The three that refused to sign were swiftly kicked out and exiled from the church. Once again, we have another major win for Arianism, and another major blemish on the record of Liberius. Many would continue to question the beliefs of Liberius, and Athanasius himself would speak out against Liberius and call him to action. It looked like Liberius continued to sit by while others, or even himself, called for the exile and condemnation of Athanasius. This time, Liberius, seemingly aware that his reputation was starting to weaken, realized he was going to have to actually speak up and do something to combat Constantius' growing power over the church. Because of this, Liberius decided that he would have to choose to either let Arianism take root or stand up for the orthodoxy and confront the emperor head-on. This may seem like an easy decision retroactively, but I don't want to overstate how serious this decision was. He was a leader of the church in one of the most prominent Christian cities in the world. He had immense power and control, but the emperor had the power to strip him of this and could even call for the life of Liberius if he wanted. But even with these worries, in 355, he made his way to the emperor's palace to officially discuss the emperor's position on Arianism. Liberius and Constantius met to persuade one another to their side. Constantius began using gentle and complimentary words to persuade Liberius over to his side. He spent much time complimenting Liberius, but when he realized kind words would not be enough, he began to try to bribe Liberius. This, of course, did not work, but it led to a final meeting where the two sounded off against each other. Constantius admitted that Liberius was one of the last pillars standing against him, and if he would simply enter into communion with all the churches that supported Arianism, everyone would be better off. Liberius, on the other hand, countered, calling for the emperor to turn from his ways, to reject Arius, and to embrace Athanasius' teachings and to follow the Nicene Creed. Unfortunately for Liberius, the emperor was not going to repent. Rather, he had doubled down and began to make it clear that if Liberius would not relent, he was not going to be able to keep his position as pope. The writings we have on this meeting conclude this way. The emperor: one question only remains to be made. I wish you to enter into communion with the churches and to send you back to Rome. Consent, therefore, to peace, and sign your assent, and then you shall return to Rome. Liberius: I have already taken leave of the brethren who are in the city. The decrees of the church are of greater importance than a residence in Rome. The emperor: you have 3 days to consider whether you will sign the document and return to Rome. If not, you must choose the place of your banishment. Liberius: neither 3 days nor 3 months can change my sentiments. Send me wherever you please. This was the final straw for Constantius. He took this situation into his own hands and officially exiled Liberius to Thrace, the mountains of modern-day Bulgaria. Liberius welcomed the decision, willingly accepting the consequences of standing up for the orthodoxy teachings of the church. This decision to stand up against the emperor helped change the atmosphere around Liberius and took him from someone who was too scared to make a stance to someone who went toe-to-toe with the emperor and didn't back down. Things had just become even more difficult for Constantius. He got rid of the last line of defense, but in doing so, he helped create a population who heavily supported Liberius no matter what the emperor said. Now, Constantius was faced with 2 major issues in replacing Liberius as pope. The first is that the lay population were actively calling for Liberius to be brought back. Historians have noted that Constantius received continual heckling throughout the next few years by Christians of Rome concerning Liberius' exile. The second issue would be that he would need to put someone in the coveted position that he would be able to persuade to follow his teachings and ideas for the Christian church. Constantius began searching for someone that would follow his command and capture the minds of the Roman Christians. The solution would come when he appointed a man who took the name Felix II to be the new bishop of Rome and become the Pope of the Christian faith. Felix II was a member of the clergy in Rome, and through either the desire for power or genuine rejection of Liberius, he accepted the promotion in 355 AD. However, this decision did not have the desired results that Felix or Constantius had expected. While it may have turned a few laities away from Liberius, the Roman people openly rejected the appointment of Felix and called for Constantius to return Liberius from exile. A quick side note I feel the need to mention. In your research, you may see some historical documents refer to Felix II as a saint. This was a historical mistake that confused Felix with a martyr by the same name who is known as an anti-Arian who lost his life for his faith. This Felix very clearly was a supporter of the movement, and there is no proof that this Felix ever died a martyr. I just wanted to mention it as some sources still refer to him as a saint, even though that is erroneous. For the next 3 years, Liberius was completely in exile. There is no recorded information about what he was doing during this time, and the only documentation we have is that the people called for his return, but he was not allowed back. But in 357 there came a word to Constantius that Liberius longed to return to his position in Rome. The context seemed to be that he would be willing to meet the previous demands of Constantius. To return from exile came with it a big price. And although we don't know what type of lifestyle he was living in exile, or how it may have broken down his body and mind, we can say that the return to his position was very costly in many different ways for Liberius. So how did Constantius and the Arians present his return from exile? The first way is through 3 letters that were originally stated to have been written by Liberius himself. These 3 letters explained that Liberius fully supported the Arian movement and that he supported the attempt to banish Athanasius. Constantius helped spread these 3 letters to many different churches, but it can be said now that these 3 letters were almost certainly forgeries. The construction of the letters, terminology used in them, and the speaking style are nothing like anything else that is recorded by Liberius. But for many, this was a sign that Liberius had given up his orthodoxy and was now supporting an Arian theology. Whether Liberius agreed to have his name associated with these letters, or simply did not reject to the forgeries being used, his actions, not to deny them, helped spread the notion of his support for the movement. The other way that his name began to be tarnished was when it was announced that he had signed one of the Sirmian creeds and had endorsed the council's belief in Arian theology. This is something that seemingly can't be thrown out. There seems to be evidence that Liberius either allowed his signature to be used or did himself sign the approval of this creed, which would be heretical to the Nicene Creed Orthodox theology. This combined with the letters made many question his motives and his allegiance to Nicene theology. It is at this moment in his life that we begin to see why he lost his opportunity to claim the title of saint. In a time which Arianism was trying to take out Orthodox belief systems and were actively causing faithful Christians to become martyrs, we have here a pope who was willing to sign an agreement that essentially diminished all the sacrifices that those martyrs had made. He ignored all the fighting that the previous popes, along with the contemporary Christians of his day, were doing to protect the true faith. There is no doubt why many historians and theologians condemned Liberius and began to question his connection to his true faith and the decision he made during this time of his life. But for Constantius, he would now have to decide how he would proceed with letting Liberius back into his papal position. He ideally wanted his chosen bishop Felix II to lead side by side with Liberius. This, however, would not be the case. Liberius gave Felix no other option, and his return to bishop meant that he alone would be the head of the church and the leader of the Roman Christians. This meant that Felix was kicked out and would be exiled himself, never to take office again in Rome. This eventually would lead him to the title of Anti-Pope Felix II, since his time as bishop would not be officially recognized by the Catholic Church historians. At this point, Arianism would reach its zenith under Constantius II and Liberius post-exile as pope. They would call the Councils of Rimini and Seleucia, which further pushed the Arian agenda, and many bishops would be turned, if not over to Arianism fully, at least to the semi-Arian view, which allowed for some of the beliefs while holding true to the Orthodox faith in others. Essentially, this allowed Constantius to seemingly bring together the whole church, even though the term unity would never actually categorize the relationship between the two opposing sides. But this new lapse in Arianism would soon come to an end in 361 AD when Constantius died. He had been the biggest supporter of the attempt to bring Arianism into Christian orthodoxy. But after his passing, the Nicene Orthodox immediately began to take back over. This was especially the case when the new emperor Julian the Apostate came into power. Julian was a pagan and wanted to restore the old imperial Roman religion. He did not like the Christians and thought it was best to simply get rid of the movement by killing all the Christians who would not give up their faith. Needless to say, the internal bickering began to stop when Christians as a whole faced extinction under the emperor. Many of those who had supported the Arian movement did so because of their political relationship to the emperor. Now that the emperor was not a supporter of the Christian movement, most of those that were not genuinely followers of Christ simply left the movement. This, along with losing their most significant supporter, meant that they began to disappear and either leave the church or convert back to the Orthodox teachings. So, what did this mean for Liberius? Well, to quote one author, during this period of Arian decline, Liberius carried out his functions as Bishop of Rome as though he had never been deeply involved either with Constantius or with the emperor's espoused cause. Liberius quickly stepped up to once again express his belief in the Nicene Orthodoxy and called his fellow clergy and those around him to believe it as well. He quickly moved to restore Athanasius as Bishop of Alexandria in 362 AD. Besides these changes, we don't have many records after the death of the emperor. He seemed to lead the church faithfully and through much persecution under the new emperor. The last notable acts we have of his pontificate was the acceptance of a large group of Macedonian bishops into communion with the Orthodox Nicene faith. We have proof of this because we have the letters that were communicated back and forth between them. The outlined belief system reads as what you would expect to hear from any traditional, accepted pope or theologian at that time. His writings seem to have been in total opposition to his previous letters he had seemingly written or the councils he had signed off on. It seemed that in his later life after the death of Constantius, he had returned fully to the Orthodox teachings, and although he never explained what happened or even sought to try to write a defense for what he did, it does seem that he had repented and turned away from his previous beliefs. His final days would come to an end in 366 AD, when on September 24th, 366, he passed away. After his passing, Damasus I would be elected pope and would see the church begin to transition to one of the major religions of the empire. He would help face down numerous heretical ideas, as well as helping solidify the canon and helping Jerome produce the Vulgate. Needless to say, Damasus I would eventually be granted the title of saint. Following Liberius, the next 13 popes would become saints. Once again, we see the relationship between being pope in the early church and becoming a saint. But now we return to Liberius, the only pope not named saint in the first 498 years of Christian history. After looking at the life of Liberius, it can be understandable that the church can have enough skepticism about the life of Liberius that would stop them from giving the title of saint. But let us not mistake the receiving of the title of saint as Liberius not having a life that should be studied by Christians today. The life of Liberius is not cut and dry. He did fall into the trap of security over faithfulness. But let us not fall into the trap that Liberius was nothing but a shallow Christian, easily swayed depending on the leadership in charge. He faced down the emperor, the most powerful man in the empire, and refused to back down. He told the emperor to his face that he did not have full authority over man, and that he needed to repent of his ways. He did this knowing that by one word of his emperor, he could have been executed. His life also shows that living the life of an exile and losing all that you had worked for is not an easy place to be in. Although the highlights of Christian history are filled with people living in exile, thrown aside, losing everything that they had for their faith, it is easy to forget how difficult this would be for any of us if we found ourselves in their position. Unfortunately, he gave up some of his integrity to receive back what he had lost in exile. Not only did he turn his back, but he actively signed off on a promotion of a heretical belief system. To this, there is no positive twist. This is the reality that many Christians have faced throughout history. He fell short of the expectation as the shepherd of the Christian flock, and his wavering caused many difficulties in the church. But ultimately, he repented of his actions, and in his final days returned to the Nicene theology, attempted to repair the damage he had done to Athanasius by restoring his position, and represented the Christian faith in an honorable way. Although Liberius was not given the status of saint, it does not mean there isn't something to learn from his life. Liberius, on the grandest stage of it all, fell short and fell into the traps of this world. But he returned to that stage and eventually turned his life around and helped lay the groundwork in his later years for the next century of Christianity. I want to leave you with one last quote about the life of Liberius and remind you that even though he was the first pope not to be named saint, it makes his life no less important to learn about. It reads, "Certainly, the church need not be embarrassed by Pope Liberius. He may not deserve veneration as a saint, but he was, in many ways, most admirable. The Pope may have weakened, but he had the courage to admit his weaknesses and attempt to make amends for his error. No one can demand or expect more from any human being." Thank you all for your time today, and I want to invite you to check out the video on the screen. If you want to see how these years played out for Athanasius and see the other side of these issues, check out my video where we looked at Athanasius of Alexandria. But I thank you again, and I'll see you next time with another informative and accessible introduction.